Alice Johnson had always believed that hard work would lead to success. From a young age, she was the kind of student who stayed up late, her room lit by the soft glow of a desk lamp, surrounded by books and notes. Science was her passion, and she dreamed of someday using her knowledge to make the world a better place. Today was supposed to be different. Today she would present her project to a panel of judges, and surely they would recognize her talent. But as Alice stood in front of them, she saw the same dismissive looks, the same tired excuses. Maybe next time. It's just not quite there. You need more experience. Little did she know, this moment would be the start of a journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about fairness, justice, and the power of one voice refusing to be silenced. Before we start listening to this story with you, please let us know where you are watching our channel from, and don't forget to share if something similar has happened in your life. I'd love to see your subscription and comments, and have a great listen. Chapter 1. The Invisible Barrier. Alice stood in front of the bathroom mirror, trying to smooth out the stubborn curls in her hair. Today was an important day. She was going to present her science project to her class, a project she had been working on for months. Her hands trembled slightly with excitement as she thought about all the hours she'd spent researching, writing, and rehearsing. This project wasn't just about a grade, it was a stepping stone toward participating in the school's prestigious science competition. Downstairs, the smell of breakfast wafted through the air. Her mother, Mrs. Johnson, was setting plates on the table while her father sat silently with a cup of coffee in his hand. Alice noticed that her parents seemed quieter than usual, exchanging tense glances every now and then. "Are you ready for today, sweetheart?" her mother asked, trying to sound enthusiastic. "Yes, I can't wait to present my project," Alice replied, trying to shake off the nervousness in her voice. Her father looked at her, a hint of concern in his eyes. "Remember, Alice, it's not always about being the best. Sometimes, no matter how hard you work, things don't go the way they should, but that doesn't mean you give up." Alice frowned. "But my project is really good, Dad. I've put so much work into it." He sighed, looking away. "I know, sweetheart. Just keep your head up, no matter what happens today." Alice didn't understand why her parents seemed so worried. This wasn't the first time she had competed in something, but it felt like there was a different weight to their words. Pushing the thought aside, she finished her breakfast and headed to school, carrying her project with her. The school hallways were buzzing with activity, students chatting about the upcoming competition. Alice's friend Laura, a white student with whom Alice had bonded over their shared love for science, walked up to her. "Alice, your project looks amazing," Laura exclaimed, glancing at the neatly organized charts and diagrams. "You've got this in the bag. I know you'll make it to the competition." "Thanks, Laura," Alice replied, feeling a bit more confident. "I hope so." As they walked into their science class, Alice noticed the judging panel at the front of the room. 3 teachers, including Mrs. Green, who was notorious for her strictness. Mr. Williams, the head science teacher, and Mrs. Miller, the guidance counselor, rounded out the panel. Alice took a deep breath, reminding herself that all her hard work would pay off. One by one, students presented their projects. Alice watched as her classmates, mostly white, received encouraging feedback, even when their projects seemed less detailed or insightful. Finally, it was her turn. She stepped up, took a deep breath, and began her presentation. Her voice grew stronger with each word as she explained the intricate details of her experiment, the problem it aimed to solve, and the potential real-world applications. She saw a few students whispering and nodding, and even noticed a couple of teachers looking impressed. When she finished, Alice stood with her chin up, waiting for the feedback. There was a long silence before Mrs. Green spoke. "It's an interesting concept, Alice. However, I'm concerned that you may not fully grasp the complexities involved in such a project. It might be a bit too advanced for you at this level." Alice's heart sank. "But I've researched this topic extensively," she protested. "I can explain any part of it in more detail if you'd like." "No need," Mrs. Green said dismissively. "Thank you for your effort. We'll let you know if you're selected." As Alice returned to her seat, she felt the sting of unfairness settle deep within her chest. She had expected some critique, but not to be dismissed so easily, as if her hard work wasn't even worth considering. Later that day, As the final list of students chosen for the competition was posted on the bulletin board, Alice scanned the names eagerly, only to feel a sharp pang of disappointment. Her name wasn't there. Instead, she saw the names of students whose projects she knew weren't as thorough or well-researched as hers. "What?" she muttered in disbelief, staring at the list. "How could they not choose me?" Laura, who had also looked at the list, tried to comfort her. "I don't understand either, Alice. Your project was way better than some of these. Something's not right." Alice nodded numbly. But what could she do? It felt like a door had been slammed in her face, one she wasn't even allowed to knock on again. Dinner table reflections. That evening at home, Alice's parents didn't seem surprised when she told them the news. Her mother sighed deeply. "I'm so sorry, sweetie. I know you worked so hard." "It's not fair," Alice burst out. "Why did they say it wasn't good enough? I did everything right." Her father exchanged a look with her mother. "Sometimes, no matter how hard you try, the odds are stacked against you," he said quietly. "We've experienced this kind of thing before, many times. But why didn't you ever say anything? Why didn't you fight it?" Alice demanded. "We tried," her mother replied, her voice tinged with sadness. "But when no one listens, when your voice doesn't matter because of the color of your skin, it's hard to keep fighting." Alice felt a wave of frustration wash over her. "That's not fair. It shouldn't be like this." "No, it shouldn't," her father agreed. "But that's the reality we face. It's up to you if you want to change it." Alice couldn't sleep that night. Her father's words echoed in her mind. It was up to her to change it. But how could she change a system that seemed so determined to silence her? A surprising ally. The next morning, Alice arrived at school with a heavy heart. As she was putting her things in her locker, Jack, one of her classmates, approached her. Jack was well-liked, a popular white student who always seemed to excel in everything he did. "Hey Alice," he began hesitantly. "I heard about what happened with your project. I'm really sorry." Alice shrugged, trying to hide the bitterness she felt. "It is what it is." "No, it's not," Jack insisted. "I talked to my sister last night. She was at your presentation. She said your project was amazing and that you were way more qualified than most of the others who got chosen. It doesn't make sense." "Welcome to my world," Alice replied with a small, sad smile. "Things don't always make sense when you look like me." Jack looked genuinely troubled. "I've never really thought about it before, but now that you mention it, you're not the first person to say something like this. Do you think it's because of—" He hesitated, then said, "Because of race?" Alice stared at him surprised. "It's not just about this one competition, Jack. It happens all the time. We're treated differently, held to a different standard, and it's exhausting." Jack nodded slowly, processing her words. "That's not right. There has to be something we can do." "I don't know what," Alice admitted. "But I'm tired of just accepting it." "Let's figure it out together," Jack said, determination in his voice. "If this is happening to you, then it's happening to others too. Maybe we can do something about it." Alice felt a flicker of hope ignite within her. "Maybe," she agreed. "Maybe we can. The teacher who cares." Later that week, Mr. Thompson, Alice's history teacher, noticed her staying behind after class, staring absently at her notebook. He had always been the kind of teacher who genuinely cared about his students, and seeing Alice, one of his brightest pupils, so dispirited, troubled him. "Everything okay, Alice?" he asked gently, sitting down at a nearby desk. Alice hesitated, then told him everything, about the competition, the dismissal of her project, and how it wasn't the first time she felt overlooked. Mr. Thompson listened carefully, his expression growing more serious with every word. "This is unacceptable," he finally said. "You deserve to be treated fairly, Alice. All of you do." "What can I do?" Alice asked, frustration lacing her voice. "How can I fight something that feels so much bigger than me?" "You don't have to fight it alone," Mr. Thompson replied. "Let's start gathering evidence. If we can prove that there's a pattern of discrimination, we'll have a stronger case. I'll help you, but it has to be done carefully." Alice nodded, feeling a sense of purpose return. For the first time, she wasn't facing this challenge alone. Chapter 2: Uncovering the Truth. Alice had always known that things weren't fair, but now, for the first time, she felt like she could do something about it. With Jack and Mr. Thompson by her side, the heavy burden of being dismissed and overlooked didn't feel as overwhelming. As they began their investigation, the trio quickly discovered that exposing the truth would be far more challenging than they had anticipated. Jack sat next to Alice in the library after school one day, poring over years of old yearbooks, competition results, and school newsletters. "Look at this," Jack said, pointing to the names of past winners. "Over the last 5 years, only 2 black students have been selected to represent our school in the regional competitions. But I remember seeing way more black students at the initial school rounds." Alice nodded, her heart sinking. "It's not just the science competition, it's everywhere. The talent show, the debate team, even sports teams. It's like we're good enough to try out, but not good enough to be chosen." Jack shook his head in disbelief. "I never noticed. I guess it's easy to ignore something when it doesn't affect you directly." Alice appreciated his honesty, even though it hurt to hear. She had grown used to being unseen, but she never imagined that someone like Jack, who was right there, could miss what was happening to her and so many others. "Maybe that's the problem," she said quietly. "People don't notice until it's pointed out to them." Together, they continued to gather evidence. Jack interviewed students who had experienced similar instances of discrimination, while Alice collected data from different school activities. She reached out to other African American students who had faced the same unfair treatment. Some of them were hesitant to speak up, afraid of the consequences, but others were willing to share their stories, encouraged by Alice's bravery. One student, Sarah, shared her experience of being denied a spot in the school's music program despite her obvious talent. "They said my voice didn't fit the style they were looking for," she said bitterly. "But I knew it was because I didn't fit the image they wanted." Alice listened, her heart aching. "You're not alone, Sarah. We're going to change this." Resistance from the administration. As the weeks went by, it became clear that their investigation wasn't going unnoticed. The school administration had started to grow suspicious of Alice and Jack's activities. One afternoon, Mr. Thompson found himself summoned to the principal's office. He sat across from Principal Reynolds, who folded his hands on his desk and leaned forward with a look of concern. "Mr. Thompson," Principal Reynolds began, "I've received reports that you've been spending an unusual amount of time with certain students after hours. Is there something going on that I should be aware of?" Mr. Thompson didn't flinch. "I'm just supporting my students, Principal Reynolds. Alice is one of the brightest students I've ever had, and I believe she deserves every opportunity to succeed." "Be that as it may," the principal continued, "we have rules and guidelines for a reason. It's not your place to interfere with the selection process or question how things are done here." "With all due respect, sir," Mr. Thompson replied, "it is my place to ensure that every student is treated fairly. And right now, that's not happening." Principal Reynolds's expression darkened. "You're walking a fine line, Mr. Thompson. I would hate to see your dedication to your students jeopardize your position here. We expect our teachers to support the administration, not undermine it." The threat was clear, but Mr. Thompson refused to back down. "My duty is to my students," he said firmly. "And I intend to fulfill that duty, no matter what." When Mr. Thompson shared this encounter with Alice and Jack later that day, Alice felt a pang of guilt. "I don't want you to lose your job because of me," she said quietly. Mr. Thompson shook his head. "This isn't just about you, Alice. It's about all the students who have been denied opportunities they rightfully earned. If I don't stand up now, who will?" A turning point. One evening, Alice sat with her parents at the dinner table, sifting through the documents and evidence she and Jack had collected. Her mother watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and worry. "You're really determined to fight this, aren't you?" Mrs. Johnson asked. "I have to, Mom," Alice replied. "It's not just for me, it's for everyone who's been told they're not good enough." Her father nodded thoughtfully. "Just be careful, Alice. Sometimes the people in power will do whatever it takes to keep things the way they are." Alice knew he was right, but she refused to be afraid. "We'll make them listen," she said with a resolve that surprised even her. "We have to." The next day, Alice decided it was time to take their findings public. With Mr. Thompson's help, she and Jack compiled a detailed report outlining the patterns of discrimination they had uncovered. They sent the report to the local newspaper, hoping that if the story gained wider attention, the school would be forced to address the issue. A few days later, the story appeared in the morning edition of the newspaper, with the headline, "Discrimination in Our Schools. Students Speak Out Against Unfair Treatment." The article detailed the experiences of Alice, Jack, and other students who had faced similar discrimination. It included quotes from Mr. Thompson about the importance of equal opportunities for all students and how the school had failed to provide that. The response was immediate and intense. Parents began calling the school demanding answers, and students were buzzing with excitement, disbelief, and outrage. For the first time, the school's unfair practices were out in the open, and people were paying attention. The administration fights back. Principal Reynolds called an emergency meeting for all staff and students, where he attempted to dismiss the accusations as misunderstandings. "Our school has always strived to be a place of inclusion and diversity," he declared. "We treat all our students equally, and any suggestion otherwise is simply untrue." But Alice wasn't about to let him rewrite the narrative. She stood up, her heart pounding, and spoke out. "How can you say that when so many of us have been treated unfairly?" Her voice was shaking, but she forced herself to continue. "We have proof, we have witnesses. This isn't just about one competition, it's about years of being overlooked and dismissed." There was a ripple of murmurs in the crowd, and Principal Reynolds looked visibly irritated. "Alice, this is not the time or place. This is exactly the time and place," Alice retorted. "You ignored us for too long, and we're done being silent." Other students started to stand up, joining Alice in solidarity. Jack raised his hand, followed by Sarah and several others who had experienced discrimination firsthand. "We all deserve to be heard," Jack said firmly, "and we won't stop until things change." A ray of hope. The tension in the room was palpable, but something shifted that day. The administration could no longer pretend that everything was fine. Principal Reynolds begrudgingly agreed to allow an independent review of the school's policies and practices, something that had never been done before. Alice, Jack, and Mr. Thompson continued their efforts, working with the parents and students who had come forward. Together, they pushed for change, demanding a fair and transparent process for all future competitions and activities. One day, as Alice was walking home from school, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Jack smiling at her. "You did it," he said. "You made them listen." Alice shook her head, smiling back. "We did it, all of us." As they stood there, basking in the first real victory of their fight, Alice realized that this was just the beginning. There was still so much work to be done, but for the first time, she felt that change was possible. She would continue to fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And with allies like Jack, Mr. Thompson, and countless others by her side, Alice knew they could overcome any barrier. Chapter 3: The Rising Storm. News of the independent review at Alice's school spread quickly. It wasn't just a local matter anymore. Other schools, parents, and students from nearby towns began to take notice. What started as a small act of resistance had grown into a movement, and for the first time, Alice felt like her voice was reaching beyond the walls that had tried to silence her for so long. But with increased attention came increased resistance. Principal Reynolds and the school administration were not going to let their authority be questioned without a fight. The pressure mounts. One Friday morning, Alice was called to the principal's office. As she entered, she found not only Principal Reynolds but also several members of the school board seated around the table. Their expressions were stern and unwelcoming. "Have a seat, Alice," Principal Reynolds said, his tone clipped. Alice sat down, her heart pounding but her gaze steady. "We're here to discuss your recent actions," began one of the school board members, a gray-haired woman named Mrs. Klein. "Your accusations against the school have caused quite a stir, and many of our stakeholders are concerned about the reputation of our institution." "I'm not trying to ruin the school's reputation," Alice replied, trying to keep her voice calm. "I'm trying to make it a better place for everyone." Mrs. Klein exchanged a glance with the other board members. "While we understand your intentions, the way you've gone about this has been disruptive. We've heard reports of you and other students staging protests, disrupting classes, and even speaking to the media without permission." Alice felt her hands clench into fists. "The reason we're speaking out is because no one was listening when we tried to do it quietly. We've been ignored for too long." Principal Reynolds leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Alice, I'm going to be very clear. If you and your friends continue with this disruptive behavior, we will have no choice but to take disciplinary action against you. This could affect your academic record and future opportunities." The threat hung in the air, and for a moment, fear gripped Alice. She thought about her dreams, her hopes for college, and how easily they could be snatched away. But then she remembered her father's words, how he had faced the same kind of threats and intimidation when he was younger, and how he had been forced to back down. "No," she thought, "not this time." "With all due respect," Alice said, lifting her chin defiantly, "you can try to silence me, but I won't stop. None of us will. We deserve to be treated equally, and I'm not going to apologize for standing up for that." The board members exchanged looks of disbelief, but Principal Reynolds simply sighed. "You may go, Alice, but consider this your final warning." Alice stood, feeling a rush of adrenaline. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady, "but I won't be needing any more warnings." A new setback. That evening, as Alice walked home, she received a frantic call from Jack. "Alice, have you seen what's happening online?" "No, why?" she asked, already feeling a sense of dread. "Someone's spreading lies about you," Jack explained. "They're saying you're just doing this for attention, that you're trying to ruin the school's reputation. There's even a fake profile pretending to be you, saying things that you never said." Alice felt her stomach drop. "What? How can they do that?" "They're trying to discredit you, Alice," Jack said. "They're scared because you're making a difference, and they know you're right." Alice hung up the phone, feeling a wave of despair wash over her. All her life, she had worked so hard to be seen for who she truly was, to prove that she was more than the stereotypes and expectations placed upon her. And now, someone was trying to take that away. When she got home, Alice's parents were already aware of what was happening. Her mother hugged her tightly. "You don't have to keep fighting if it's too much, Alice. You've already done more than anyone could have asked." But Alice shook her head. "No, Mom, this isn't just about me anymore. If I back down now, they'll just do this to the next person and the person after that." Her father nodded. "Then we'll stand with you. Whatever happens next, we're right here, the turning point." The next day at school, things took a turn for the worse. Mr. Thompson, the one teacher who had been on their side from the beginning, was called into the administration office and didn't come out for hours. When he finally emerged, his face was pale and his eyes were red-rimmed, as if he'd been fighting back tears. "I've been put on probation," he told Alice and Jack, his voice thick with emotion. "The principal claims that my actions were unprofessional and that I violated the school's code of conduct by supporting you." "This is insane," Jack exclaimed. "They can't just do this." "They can, and they have," Mr. Thompson said bitterly. "But that doesn't mean I'm giving up. I'll keep helping you as much as I can, but I need to be more careful. They're watching me now." Alice felt a surge of guilt. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Thompson. I didn't mean to get you into trouble." Mr. Thompson shook his head. "Don't you dare apologize. You're doing something important, something that needed to be done a long time ago. If the cost of standing by you is my job, then so be it. But I have a feeling that if we keep pushing, we might just win this." A ray of hope. A week later, Alice received an unexpected email. It was from a local journalist named Samantha Lee, who had read about Alice's story in the newspaper and wanted to meet her. "I think there's a bigger story here," the email read. "If you're willing to talk, I'd like to help you share it." Alice and Jack met Samantha at a small coffee shop near the school. The journalist listened intently as they recounted everything they had discovered, the years of discrimination, the unfair treatment, the threats, and Mr. Thompson's probation. "This is more than just a school issue," Samantha said, jotting down notes. "This is a systemic problem, and you're shining a light on something a lot of people would rather keep hidden." "But how can we fight back when they have all the power?" Jack asked, frustration evident in his voice. "You keep doing what you're doing," Samantha replied. "And you let people like me amplify your story. The more attention we bring to this, the harder it will be for them to hide." The article that Samantha wrote was published a few days later, and it hit the community like a lightning bolt. This time, it wasn't just about Alice's story. It was about the wider issue of discrimination in the education system, about how schools across the country were failing their students by allowing prejudice to dictate opportunities. Parents, students, and even teachers from other schools started to reach out, sharing their own experiences of discrimination and offering their support. The momentum grew, and soon, the school board could no longer ignore what was happening. The school board meeting. The following month, a public school board meeting was scheduled to address the growing controversy. The room was packed, with parents, students, teachers, and community members all eager to voice their opinions. Alice and Jack sat together in the front row, feeling the weight of the moment. When it was finally Alice's turn to speak, she stood and faced the board members, her voice clear and unwavering. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she began. "I'm here because I believe that every student, regardless of their race, background, or appearance, deserves to be treated with fairness and respect. Our school is supposed to be a place where we learn and grow, but how can we do that if some of us are never given a chance?" The room erupted in applause, and Alice felt tears prick at her eyes. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for everyone who had ever felt invisible, everyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough. The board members listened, and for the first time, they seemed to take Alice's words to heart. They announced that an independent committee would be formed to investigate the allegations and make recommendations for policy changes. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a start. As Alice walked out of the meeting, surrounded by her parents, Jack, Mr. Thompson, and countless others who had supported her along the way, she felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt before. "This is just the beginning," Jack said, smiling at her. "We're not done yet." Alice nodded, her heart swelling with determination. "No," she agreed, "we're not done yet." And with that, they walked out into the night, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Chapter 4: The Breaking Point. The days following the school board meeting were a whirlwind of emotions. For the first time, Alice felt a glimmer of hope that things might actually change. But that hope was quickly tested when the school administration launched a campaign to discredit her efforts and those of her allies. Posters appeared around the school with slogans like, "Keep our school's reputation intact," and "Don't let one voice drown out the majority." Some students, egged on by their parents or simply afraid of change, began to treat Alice and Jack with open hostility. "Traitor," one boy muttered under his breath as Alice walked past him in the hallway. "Just give it up already," sneered another. "You're making things worse for everyone." Alice tried to ignore them, but each comment cut a little deeper. She knew that change was never easy, but she hadn't anticipated how lonely the fight would feel. It seemed that, for every person who supported her, there were two more who wanted to see her fail. Jack, on the other hand, remained a steady source of support. "Don't let them get to you," he said one afternoon as they sat outside, away from the prying eyes and whispered insults. "They're just scared. People always fear what they don't understand." "I know," Alice replied, her voice heavy with exhaustion, "but it's hard. Sometimes I feel like I'm shouting into a void." "Maybe," Jack said thoughtfully. "But that doesn't mean no one's listening." A surprise setback. As if things weren't difficult enough, Alice's world was shaken once again when she arrived at school one morning to find Mr. Thompson's classroom door locked. A handwritten sign read, "Class canceled until further notice." Panic seized her, and she rushed to the principal's office, demanding answers. "What's happened to Mr. Thompson?" Alice asked, her voice trembling with anxiety. Principal Reynolds gave her a tight, insincere smile. "Mr. Thompson has been placed on administrative leave while we investigate allegations of misconduct." "What misconduct?" Alice shot back, refusing to be intimidated. "He's the best teacher in this school." "You're just trying to get rid of him because he's been helping us." The principal's smile disappeared. "That's enough, Alice. I suggest you focus on your studies rather than involving yourself in matters that don't concern you." Alice stormed out of the office, her heart pounding with anger and fear. She had known that they would try to silence Mr. Thompson, but she hadn't expected it to happen so soon. Without him, she felt like they had lost one of their strongest pillars of support. "I'm so sorry, Alice," Jack said when she told him the news. "This isn't fair." "No, it's not," Alice replied, tears welling in her eyes. "But I'm not going to let them win. I can't." Rallying the community. With Mr. Thompson gone, Alice and Jack knew they had to do something drastic to keep the momentum going. They decided to organize a school-wide rally, inviting parents, students, teachers, and members of the community to speak out against the discrimination and unfair practices they had experienced. The night before the rally, Alice stood in her room, staring at her reflection in the mirror. What if no one shows up? She whispered to herself. What if it's all for nothing? Her mother entered the room, wrapping her arms around her daughter. You've already done more than most people ever would, Alice. Whatever happens tomorrow, know that we're proud of you. You've given a voice to those who've been silent for far too long. Alice nodded, fighting back tears. Thanks, Mom, I hope it's enough. The next morning, Alice and Jack stood on the steps of the school, waiting for people to arrive. At first, it seemed like no one was coming. They stood there in tense silence, feeling the weight of all their hopes and fears pressing down on them. And then, a small group of students appeared at the end of the street. As they got closer, Alice recognized Sarah, the girl who had been rejected from the music program, leading the way. Behind her was a group of parents, followed by more students, teachers, and even some members of the community. Within minutes, the school steps were filled with people, holding signs that read, "Justice for all students, equality now," and "We stand with Alice." The sight took Alice's breath away, and for the first time in weeks, she felt the heaviness in her chest begin to lift. Jack squeezed her hand. "You did it," he whispered. "They're here." The rally. Alice took a deep breath and stepped forward to address the crowd. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice shaky but growing stronger with every word. "For so long we've been told that we don't belong, that we're not good enough. But we are. We've always been enough. And it's time that the world sees that." The crowd erupted in applause, and Alice felt a surge of energy course through her. She spoke about the discrimination she and others had faced, about Mr. Thompson's suspension, and about the need for real lasting change. One by one, others stepped forward to share their stories. Sarah spoke about being denied her place in the music program. Another student talked about being overlooked for leadership roles despite having the highest grades. And a parent spoke about the unfair treatment their son had faced in sports. As the rally continued, Alice noticed a group of journalists and news crews gathering on the outskirts. The story was spreading, reaching beyond their school and into the wider community. "We're not going to be silent anymore," Jack declared, taking the microphone. "This is our school, our future, and we have the power to change it. Together." The crowd cheered, and for the first time, Alice felt that they were truly making a difference. The principal's final stand. As the rally came to an end, Principal Reynolds emerged from the school, flanked by several security guards. "This rally is unauthorized," he shouted, trying to regain control of the situation. "You all need to disperse immediately or there will be consequences." "No," Alice shouted back, stepping forward. "We have the right to be heard. You can't silence us." Principal Reynolds' face turned an alarming shade of red. "You think you can just ignore the rules? You're jeopardizing your futures. This is not how change happens." "Change happens when people refuse to be silenced," Jack retorted. "We're not going anywhere." The principal's eyes flickered with uncertainty, and for a moment it seemed like he might lash out. But then, something unexpected happened. Mr. Thompson appeared, pushing his way through the crowd with a piece of paper in his hand. "This is an injunction," Mr. Thompson announced, holding it up for everyone to see. "It's signed by the school board, and it prohibits you, Principal Reynolds, from taking any disciplinary action against these students for exercising their right to peaceful protest." A stunned silence fell over the crowd as Principal Reynolds snatched the paper and read it, his hands shaking. This isn't over," he muttered. But the fight had gone out of him. "No," Alice said, her voice steady and clear. "It's just beginning, a step forward." In the days that followed, the story of Alice's fight spread beyond their town, sparking conversations about discrimination in schools across the state. The independent committee completed its investigation and found clear evidence of systemic bias within the school's programs and competitions. As a result, new policies were implemented to ensure fairness and equal opportunities for all students regardless of race or background. Mr. Thompson was reinstated, and Alice was invited to represent her school in the regional science competition, an opportunity that was long overdue. The morning of the competition, Alice stood on the stage, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced out into the audience and saw her parents, Jack, Mr. Thompson, and so many others who had supported her. For the first time, she felt truly seen, not just as a student or a girl fighting against the odds, but as someone who had the power to make a difference. "I'd like to dedicate this presentation," she said, looking out into the audience, "to everyone who has ever felt unheard, invisible, or unworthy. This is for you." As she began her presentation, Alice felt a sense of peace wash over her. This wasn't the end of her journey. There were still battles to be fought, still voices to be heard. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that they were on the path to something greater. And together, they would change the world. Chapter 5. A New Beginning. The weeks following the rally felt like a whirlwind. Alice could hardly believe how much had changed since she first stood in front of her classmates, speaking out against the discrimination she and so many others had faced. The story had spread far beyond their small town, igniting discussions about fairness and equality in schools across the state. And for the first time, Alice felt the weight of her actions truly making a difference. Real changes, real impact. The independent committee released a comprehensive report on the school's practices, confirming everything Alice, Jack, Mr. Thompson, and the other students had suspected. The report detailed instances of discrimination, favoritism, and systemic bias, providing clear evidence that students of color had been routinely denied opportunities for years. As a result, the school board implemented a series of reforms to address the issues, including a complete overhaul of the selection process for competitions, clubs, and programs, ensuring transparency and equal opportunities for all students, the establishment of a student advisory board to advocate for the concerns and needs of the student body, giving every student a voice in how the school was run, regular training for teachers and staff on diversity, equity, and inclusion, aimed at fostering a more inclusive environment. Principal Reynolds, faced with overwhelming evidence of his role in perpetuating discrimination, was asked to step down. In his place, the school board appointed Ms. Ramirez, a passionate educator known for her commitment to fairness and student advocacy. The day Ms. Ramirez addressed the student body for the first time, Alice stood in the crowd with Jack, Mr. Thompson, and her parents by her side. "This is not just about righting the wrongs of the past," Ms. Ramirez said, her voice strong and clear. "This is about building a future where every student, regardless of who they are, is given the opportunity to succeed." And it all started with a brave young woman who refused to be silent. Alice felt a lump form in her throat as Ms. Ramirez looked directly at her. The entire assembly erupted in applause, and for a moment, Alice felt like she was floating, weightless and free. It wasn't just her victory, it was everyone's, a time for celebration. That evening, the Johnson household was filled with laughter, music, and the delicious smell of home-cooked food. Alice's parents had invited family, friends, and neighbors to celebrate her achievements. Jack, Sarah, and several other students from the rally were there too, enjoying the warmth and camaraderie that filled the house. "To Alice," Mr. Johnson declared, raising his glass of sparkling cider, "to our brave daughter, who showed us all that it's never too late to fight for what's right." "To Alice," everyone echoed, and Alice felt her cheeks flush with pride and happiness. After the toast, Alice and Jack stepped outside, escaping the noise for a moment of quiet. They stood together on the porch, gazing up at the night sky, where a blanket of stars twinkled overhead. "You know," Jack said, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. And I realized that if it weren't for you, I probably would have gone my whole life without noticing how unfair things can be." Alice smiled. "Well, I couldn't have done it without you. You stood by me when things got tough, and that made all the difference." Jack looked at her thoughtfully. "What's next for you, Alice? What do you want to do now that you've changed the world?" Alice laughed softly. "I don't know if I've changed the world just yet, but I think I want to keep going. There are so many other things that need to change, so many other people who deserve to be heard. I want to be a part of that." Jack nodded. "Whatever you do, I know you're going to make a difference." They stood there for a while longer, the silence between them filled with unspoken gratitude and the sense that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The science competition. The regional science competition took place a month later, and Alice was determined to give it her all. This time, as she stood in front of the judges, she felt confident, not because she believed she would win, but because she knew she had earned her place there. She presented her project with poise and passion, answering every question with clarity and precision. When she finished, she looked out at the audience and saw Mr. Thompson smiling proudly, Jack giving her a thumbs up, and her parents beaming with pride. For the first time, she felt the weight of their expectations lift, replaced by the lightness of possibility. When the judges announced the winners, Alice's heart skipped a beat as they called her name. She had won first place. The room erupted in applause, but for Alice, the victory wasn't just about the trophy or the recognition. It was about proving to herself, and to everyone else, that she was capable, talented, and deserving. A new chapter. Back at school, Alice's life had taken on a new rhythm. She joined the Student Advisory Board, where she worked with Jack, Sarah, and other students to make sure their voices were heard. They organized workshops, invited guest speakers, and held regular meetings with Ms. Ramirez to discuss issues that mattered to the student body. One day, as Alice was walking through the school halls, she noticed a group of younger students huddled together, whispering excitedly. As she passed, one of them called out, "Hey, you're Alice, right? The one who stood up for everyone?" Alice nodded, surprised. "Yeah, that's me." The boy grinned. "You're awesome. I want to be like you when I grow up." Alice felt a warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you," she said, smiling. "But you don't have to wait until you grow up to make a difference. You can start right now." As she walked away, Alice felt a sense of pride that went beyond any competition or award. She had started something that would continue long after she graduated. Graduation day. The day of Alice's graduation arrived, and the entire school gathered to celebrate the achievements of the senior class. As she walked across the stage to receive her diploma, the audience erupted into applause, and Alice felt tears prick at her eyes. She had made it. Despite all the challenges, the setbacks, and the doubts, she had made it. When she returned to her seat, Ms. Ramirez stepped up to the podium. "Today, we honor the achievements of all our graduates," she began, "but there is one student who deserves special recognition for her courage, her determination, and her unwavering commitment to justice." Alice's heart skipped a beat as Ms. Ramirez looked directly at her. "Alice Johnson, on behalf of the faculty, staff, and students of this school, I want to thank you for showing us all what it means to be a leader. You have inspired us, and we are so proud to call you one of our own." The crowd rose to their feet, applauding as Alice stood, overwhelmed with emotion. She had always dreamed of this moment, but she never imagined it would feel so powerful, so affirming. As the ceremony ended, Alice looked around at the faces of her family, her friends, and her community, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had started this journey with the hope of changing her school, but in the process, she had changed herself. And she knew with absolute certainty that this was only the beginning.